Lewis Hamilton arrived at the circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya with the kind of presence that didn't just command attention, it demanded it. The mere sight of him stepping out of the Mercedes-AMG Petronas garage sent an unspoken ripple of energy through the paddock. His every move carried a weight that only a 7-time world champion could possess. This wasn't just another day of testing. For Hamilton, there was no such thing as an ordinary session. Every lap, every turn, every millisecond mattered. Whether the grandstands were packed with roaring fans or completely empty, his mindset remained unchanged. He was here to compete. And on this particular day, the air crackled with anticipation. Ferrari had arrived with an unshakable sense of purpose, a quiet but unmistakable confidence that hinted at something more than just routine development. Their SF24 had been making waves throughout the morning session, slicing through the Catalan circuit with a newfound precision, its sleek red bodywork shimmering under the Spanish sun. The whispers had already begun. This wasn't just another Ferrari. This was something different. Something dangerous. Something built to win. And at the helm of this machine was Charles Leclerc. The young Monegasque had been relentless. Lap after lap, he attacked the circuit with an aggression that bordered on reckless, but was in truth, meticulously calculated. The stopwatch didn't lie, his times were rapid, his consistency unwavering. In the garages, engineers huddled around monitors, nodding in approval as data streamed in. There was an unspoken belief spreading like wildfire. Ferrari had found something. Something that might, finally, put them in striking distance of Mercedes. But Hamilton had seen this story unfold too many times before. He had witnessed the rise and fall of countless challengers. He had heard the murmurs, the speculations, the early proclamations of teams believing they had cracked the code to dethroning the Silver Arrows. And yet, when the real battle began, it was always Hamilton who delivered the final word. Today, he had no intention of letting Ferrari walk away from this test, believing they had the upper hand. As he sat in the cockpit, the familiar hum of the Mercedes power unit resonating through his body, he exhaled slowly, methodically. He wasn't just a driver, he was a tactician, a gladiator stepping into the arena. He tightened his gloves, adjusted his visor, and let the adrenaline build. The garage doors slid open, revealing the vast expanse of asphalt ahead. The moment had arrived. It was time to lay down the gauntlet. The Mercedes rolled out of the pit lane with a low growl, its aerodynamic form slicing through the crisp afternoon air. Hamilton's outlap was calm, precise, a reconnaissance mission to gauge the track conditions. He felt the grip levels, tested the limits of traction, noted every subtle change in the tarmac surface. But when he crossed the start-slash-finish line to begin his first flying lap, everything changed. The world around him blurred into insignificance. The car was an extension of his very being, responding to his every command with razor-sharp precision. The first sector was clinical. Hamilton's hands moved with effortless fluidity, his braking points hit with absolute perfection. Every fraction of a second mattered. He wasn't just driving, he was carving his legacy into the asphalt. As he approached the sweeping turn 9, he kept the throttle pinned longer than seemed possible, the car twitching but holding firm as he powered through the corner with unwavering commitment. The delta on his steering wheel flashed green. He was up. In the Ferrari garage, Leclerc's eyes locked onto the timing screens. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Hamilton was doing. This wasn't just about testing setups or gathering data. This was a psychological statement. Hamilton was declaring, without saying a word, that Mercedes was still the team to beat. And Leclerc, fueled by a mix of admiration and defiance, refused to back down. He climbed into his own cockpit, the Ferrari's engine firing up with a ferocious roar that sent vibrations through the floor. His mechanic stepped back, giving him space as the car rolled out onto the track. The hunt was on. The SF24 darted through the corners with an elegance that suggested something revolutionary lay beneath its surface. Leclerc's driving was fearless, aggressive, a pure expression of raw speed. He wasn't just trying to match Hamilton, he was trying to surpass him. Sector by sector, the duel played out on the timing boards. Hamilton would set a blistering time, only for Leclerc to answer back with an equally impressive lap. The track had transformed into an invisible battlefield, two warriors exchanging blows without ever seeing each other face to face. Engineers on both sides monitored every split, every data point, watching the numbers tell a story that transcended mere testing. And then, in a moment that felt almost scripted by fate, they found themselves on the same stretch of track. Hamilton exited the pit lane just as Leclerc came flying down the main straight. The Mercedes slotted in ahead, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to turn this silent rivalry into something tangible. Leclerc saw the familiar silver silhouette and knew, this was no longer about numbers. This was personal. He closed the gap, his front wing nearly kissing the diffuser of the Mercedes as they barreled into turn 1. Hamilton, aware of the challenger lurking in his mirrors, didn't flinch. He held his line, braking at the absolute last possible moment before diving into the apex. Leclerc mirrored his every move, refusing to give an inch. It was a game of high-speed chess, two grandmasters pushing each other to the absolute limit. Lap after lap, they danced on the razor's edge of control and chaos. The lap times continued to fall, the intensity reaching a fever pitch. In the garages, team members stood frozen, eyes glued to the monitors, breaths held in suspense. Even though no championship points were on the line, this felt like a title fight. It was a glimpse into the battles yet to come, a preview of the war that would rage across the season. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the session ended. The cars rolled back into their respective garages, engines shutting down, the air thick with heat and unspoken challenges. Hamilton climbed out of his cockpit, removing his helmet with a slow, deliberate motion. His face remained unreadable, but the glint in his eyes spoke volumes. He had sent his message. Leclerc, breathing heavily, pulled off his gloves and leaned back in his seat. He knew he had pushed hard, but deep down, he also knew that Hamilton had been holding something back. The veteran wasn't just fast, he was calculated. He had left just enough on the table to keep the mystery alive, to remind everyone that his true pace was still a well-guarded secret. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the circuit, one thing was clear: this was not just a test day. This was a declaration of intent. Hamilton was still the king. And Leclerc, despite all his speed, all his talent, still had a mountain to climb. The season hadn't even started, but the battle had already begun. The lap that shook the paddock, when Hamilton unleashed pure speed. For hours, the circuit had been a theater of patience, a slow, grinding chess match where every move was calculated, every action designed for the long game. No one was taking risks. No one was showing their hand. The drivers, locked into their programs, lapped with clinical precision, each lap a mere piece of data in a larger puzzle. High fuel loads, conservative engine maps, tire degradation studies. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just relentless efficiency. But beneath this meticulous calm, tension simmered. The air was thick with the kind of expectation that precedes a storm, because everyone knew that soon, very soon, the gloves would come off. The session was building towards its crescendo. And when the time came, one driver was ready to seize the moment. That driver was Lewis Hamilton. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya, the conditions reached their absolute peak. The track surface, heated by hours of relentless running, had now settled into perfect form. The earlier gusts of unpredictable wind had mellowed into a steady, manageable breeze. The chaotic fluctuations of grip had evened out, offering drivers a rare moment where the car could be pushed to its absolute limit. And Hamilton knew it. Then came the radio call. Box this lap. Soft tires going on. It was a simple instruction, one that could have easily been overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the nuances of the sport. But those who knew, those who understood the code of Formula One, recognized it immediately for what it was. This was not a routine run. This was not just another lap. This was an attack. Hamilton didn't respond. He didn't need to. His entire demeanor shifted, his posture tightening ever so slightly in the cockpit. A quiet, almost imperceptible nod. A silent acknowledgement that the moment had arrived. He guided the car into the pit lane with effortless control, rolling to a stop with pinpoint precision. The Mercedes pit crew, a machine of flawless synchronization, descended upon the car in a blur of motion. The soft compound Pirellis, designed for maximum grip, engineered for sheer velocity, were fitted in an instant. A final adjustment to the front wing. A last glance at the telemetry. Then, with a crisp release, Hamilton was back on track. And that's when everything changed. The build-up, from calm to chaos. Exiting the pits, Hamilton was not just another driver on the circuit. He was a predator entering the hunt, his instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. He was not here to collect data. He was not here to test fuel loads or tire longevity. He was here to attack. His outlap was a masterclass in precision. Every movement was deliberate, every action perfectly calculated. He didn't waste a single ounce of energy. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his breathing slow and measured. This was control at its highest level. Through the first few corners, he weaved ever so slightly, just enough to generate heat into the fresh rubber. The soft tires were still waking up, their molecules rearranging themselves into the optimal temperature window. Hamilton felt everything, the slightest change in grip, the smallest shift in balance. The steering wheel wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his consciousness. By the time he reached the final sector, everything was ready. The car, the tires, the track, the driver. And then, as he approached the final chicane, he took one deep breath. The lap that defied reality. And then, he unleashed hell. The moment he crossed the line, the entire circuit seemed to hold its breath. The Mercedes exploded forward with unrelenting ferocity, the engine roaring as it reached its full throttle potential. This was no longer a test session. This was a declaration. Turn 1 came faster than should have been possible. Braking? Late. Commitment? Absolute. He dove into the corner with a kind of confidence that bordered on insanity, the rear tires squirming under the forces being exerted upon them. Any lesser driver would have flinched, would have lifted off the throttle just slightly, just enough to stabilize the car. Hamilton didn't. Full commitment into turn 3, flat out. The G-forces threatened to rip the breath from his lungs as the car clung to the racing line by the barest margin. Any imperfection, any hesitation, and the lap would have been over. But there was no hesitation. Only instinct. Sector 1, purple. Fastest of the day. The radio crackled to life in the background, but Hamilton wasn't listening. His world had narrowed to a single objective: perfect execution. The high-speed left-right sequence of turn 7 and 8 approached at a terrifying pace. It was here where bravery separated the great from the good. Most lifted slightly here. Hamilton did not. The car twitched violently, the rear end dancing on the absolute limit, but he was already ahead of the moment. A slight correction. A micro-adjustment. And just like that, he was through. Turn 9, one of the most fearsome corners on the circuit. Flat out in qualifying trim, but only for those with absolute faith in their machinery. Hamilton kept his foot buried in the throttle, trusting the car, trusting himself. The Mercedes surged through at unimaginable speed, tires screaming, but never breaking grip. Sector 2, purple. Fastest of the day. The lap was now reaching its climax. The final sector, the true test of a car's mechanical grip. No high-speed heroics here, only raw, unfiltered precision. The slow-speed chicane was an infuriating interruption to the otherwise flowing circuit, but Hamilton attacked it. Late braking. Aggressive rotation. Perfect throttle modulation. And then, the final straight. Hamilton unleashed everything. The Mercedes rocketed forward, engine screaming in fury, speed climbing with unrelenting aggression. The finish line was hurtling towards him. And in that last fraction of a second before he crossed it, he knew. Sector 3, purple. Fastest of the day. The lap, fastest of the session. The aftermath, a message to the grid. The radio came to life once more. P1. Fastest lap. Purple in all 3 sectors. Still, Hamilton did not react. No celebration. No exclamation of triumph. Only the quiet, knowing confidence of a driver who had just sent a message to the entire paddock. They had just witnessed something special. For the rest of the grid, the warning was clear. Lewis Hamilton was ready. And Formula One would never be the same. The tension was palpable. Every single spectator in the grandstands leaned forward, their breath stolen by the sheer anticipation of what they were about to witness. The Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One car stood on the edge of the tarmac, its sleek, aerodynamically perfected bodywork shimmering under the floodlights like a predator preparing to strike. This wasn't just a machine. This was a weapon. A technological marvel sculpted from the collective genius of hundreds of the world's greatest engineers, a masterpiece of carbon fiber, titanium, and computational wizardry, all condensed into one singular purpose-driven entity: speed. Absolute, mind-bending, physics-defying speed. And at the helm of this mechanical beast, Sir Lewis Hamilton. A man who didn't just drive Formula One cars, he bent them to his will. A split second of silence. Then, like the roar of 1,000 war drums, the hybrid power unit ignited with a ferocity that sent shockwaves through the asphalt. The sound wasn't just noise, it was an announcement. A declaration of war against the clock itself. Hamilton's foot came down on the throttle like the hammer of a vengeful god. And then all hell broke loose. The car exploded forward, the sheer violence of acceleration slamming Hamilton back into his seat with unrelenting force. The wheels spun for the briefest of moments, barely able to contain the monstrous 1,000 plus horsepower surging through them, before they hooked onto the tarmac and unleashed every ounce of energy like a controlled detonation. The world outside became a blur. The grandstands? Gone. The pit wall? A streak of color. The circuit? Nothing more than a flickering ribbon of asphalt vanishing beneath him at a rate the human brain could barely comprehend. 100 kilometers per hour. 200 kilometers per hour. 250 kilometers per hour. 300 kilometers per hour. The Mercedes wasn't accelerating, it was teleporting. And just when any sane person would have lifted, when instinct would have screamed for mercy, Hamilton flicked his thumb over the steering wheel. DRS activated. The rear wing flaps snapped open. Air resistance vanished. The car went from merely fast to outright terrifying. 327 kilometers per hour. Faster than a bullet train. Faster than logic should allow. Faster than should be humanly possible. And then, turn 1 loomed ahead like an executioner's blade. This was no ordinary corner. This was the place where champions were forged or broken, where the bravest souls clashed headfirst with the very limits of physics. The braking zone was so violently aggressive that lesser drivers had seen their entire careers crumble into the gravel traps. But Hamilton? He didn't flinch. He stayed on the throttle longer than any sane human would dare, a full heartbeat longer than anyone else. The breaking point came and went. And still, he didn't lift. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the kind of move that would send a rookie straight into the barriers, headfirst at 300 kilometers per hour. And yet, at the very last possible millisecond, Hamilton stomped the brake pedal with the precision of a NASA launch sequence. The tires screamed in protest, their tortured cries echoing across the circuit as the car bled speed at an earth-shattering rate. The forces slammed into Hamilton's body with such brutal intensity that his ribs felt like they were about to be crushed. -6 G. His body was experiencing forces greater than a fighter pilot ejecting from a jet. But even as his organs were being rearranged by the sheer violence of the braking, Hamilton wasn't done. Because turn 1 wasn't just about survival, it was about perfection. With the grace of an artist painting on a canvas made of asphalt, Hamilton flicked the steering wheel with absolute precision. The front tires bit the track with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. The rear end wanted to step out. It begged for mercy. Hamilton denied it. The car snapped into the apex like it was locked onto rails, every single millimeter accounted for, every single detail executed with mechanical perfection. And then, he was through. Not just surviving. Not just making it. Dominating. Turn 2 arrived in an instant. No time to breathe. No time to celebrate. The car was an extension of his very soul now, reacting to his every input before he even consciously thought about it. Then, turn 3. The monster. The test of gods. This wasn't a corner. This was a battlefield. The legendary right-hander that had humbled even the greatest. Flat out or nothing. There was no in-between. This was where the weak lifted. Hamilton? He went full throttle. The G-forces hit him like a sledgehammer. The downforce slammed the car into the asphalt with such unrelenting force that if the suspension even flinched, the entire machine would have been torn apart. 290 kilometers per hour. No lifting. No hesitation. The car was screaming, begging for release. Hamilton held firm. The steering wheel vibrated violently, the aerodynamic grip balancing on the edge of catastrophe. 1 inch offline, and it was all over. But Hamilton's hands were steady. His mind was clear. His soul was locked into the singular pursuit of greatness. And then, turn 4. The final test. The deceptive left-hander that had claimed the souls of countless hopefuls. Brake too late? Game over. Brake too early? Mediocrity. Hamilton? He braked at the exact nanosecond required for absolute perfection. Not a fraction of a second sooner. Not a fraction of a second later. The car rotated with the elegance of a perfectly thrown dart, the balance maintained with such divine precision that it felt preordained by the universe itself. And then, as he roared out of turn 4, throttle wide open, engine screaming, tires begging for mercy, he knew. This wasn't just a lap. This wasn't just racing. This was Lewis Hamilton proving, once again, that he wasn't just a driver. He was a force of nature. A living legend. The undisputed master of speed. And the world? The world could only watch. In awe. The descent into turn 5 was more than just a technical challenge. It was a battlefield, a brutal test of nerve, skill, and sheer instinct. The steep drop meant that any misjudgment, any fraction of overcommitment, could result in catastrophic understeer, sending the car wide and destroying an otherwise immaculate lap. But Lewis Hamilton? He wasn't just driving. He was sculpting the perfect lap with the precision of a master craftsman. His foot feathered the throttle with almost supernatural finesse, a fraction of a degree dictating the exact amount of grip needed to keep the rear in check. The engine roared beneath him, a mechanical beast barely contained, desperate to break loose. But Hamilton held it in submission, an untamed predator bending to his absolute will. As he exited the corner, the car catapulted forward, the acceleration so ferocious it seemed as if the laws of physics had been rewritten just for him. Every millisecond counted, every shift in weight a calculated move in the game of milliseconds. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, his vision narrowing, the world around him dissolving into a tunnel of pure speed. His hands gripped the wheel with an ironclad focus, his mind calculating variables in real time, predicting traction limits, tire wear, brake temperature, airflow disruption from the car ahead, all in the blink of an eye. And then, without even a moment to breathe, he launched into the treacherous sequence of turns 6, 7, and 8, a gauntlet that separated the elite from the merely excellent. Here, the car danced on the razor's edge of adhesion, every ounce of grip exploited to its absolute limit. Lesser drivers hesitated here, afraid of unsettling the balance, but Hamilton attacked it like a predator on the hunt. Each curve was devoured with precision, every apex clipped with the meticulousness of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. The weight transfer was seamless, as if the car were an extension of his own body, the suspension compressing and releasing in perfect harmony with his input. His hands barely moved, only the slightest corrections necessary, proof that he was not reacting to the car, he was anticipating it. It was otherworldly. The sheer force being exerted on the tires was astronomical, the rubber screaming against the asphalt as Hamilton extracted every last ounce of performance, pushing the boundaries of what should have been possible. And then came the behemoth. Turn 9. The corner of courage. A place where even the greatest felt their pulse quicken, where champions questioned their own mortality. The entry speed was absurd, borderline impossible. This was a section where others might lift, even for a split second, a flicker of doubt creeping into their mind. But Hamilton? He never lifted. Not even a millimeter. Foot planted, full commitment, absolute trust in his own reflexes and the machine beneath him. The rear snapped violently, protesting against the absurd forces at play, but he tamed it with a barely perceptible flick of the wheel, an instinctual countersteer executed with a kind of precision that defied human reaction time. The car wobbled for a fraction of a second, then it was rock solid again, and he was gone, rocketing down the back straight at a velocity that seemed to defy reason. The track blurred past as he reached the braking zone for turn 10, a sector where lap time could vanish in an instant if not approached with absolute mastery. This was where bravery met intelligence, where aggression had to be tempered with finesse. The braking force was monstrous, the deceleration brutal enough to crush lesser men. But Hamilton wasn't just a driver, he was a warrior in the cockpit. His braking point was impossibly late, so late that it seemed as if he had momentarily forgotten the concept of stopping. Yet, at the exact moment where disaster seemed inevitable, he flicked the car into rotation with an elegance that should have been impossible at such an absurd entry speed. The tires clawed at the tarmac, screaming in protest but obeying his command. No slide, no overcorrection, just an ice-cold execution of a perfect maneuver. He was in complete control, threading the needle between risk and reward with the precision of an assassin. Every motion was intentional, every microsecond accounted for. He wasn't just fast, he was transcendent. The level of focus required was beyond comprehension, his mind working at hyperspeed, calculating the precise moment to apply throttle, to counteract understeer, to ensure that not a single ounce of energy was wasted. His eyes flicked up to the display, lap delta flashing green. He was on pace to break the record. The final sector loomed, a treacherous stretch where time could be lost in an instant and legends could be made. This was the moment of truth. Every apex, every braking zone, every throttle input had to be perfect. There was no margin for error, no second chances. But Hamilton had no doubts, no hesitation. He was operating on a level beyond what most could comprehend, a state of flow so deep it bordered on clairvoyance. He wasn't just driving the car, he was one with it. The speed, the precision, the sheer audacity of it all. He was threading a needle at over 200 miles per hour, and yet it looked effortless. The final corners flashed by in a blur, his every action a study in mechanical poetry. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his grip on the wheel was steady, his breathing controlled. He had done it before. He would do it again. Because that's what champions do. And then, in a flash, the lap was complete. The pit wall erupted. The crowd stood in stunned silence before exploding into cheers. The stopwatch told the story, the fastest lap of the day. A lap for the ages. A lap that would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered as a testament to the absolute peak of human and mechanical synergy. This wasn't just driving. This was something else. Something greater. Lewis Hamilton had just rewritten what was possible on four wheels. And the world would never forget it. Turn 11, flawless. Not just a clean execution, but an absolute masterclass in precision. The way the car responded to his touch was not just mechanical, it was instinctive, like an extension of his own will. The rear tires held the perfect slip angle, the front end bit into the apex with surgical accuracy, and in a fraction of a second, he was gone. The steering wheel twitched in his grip as he corrected, not out of error, but out of mastery. He was operating on a level beyond comprehension. The world outside blurred, the screaming engine drowning out everything except the relentless focus inside the cockpit. Turn 12, violent yet calculated. This was the moment that separated the elite from the legends. Most drivers feared it, their reflexes hesitating for the slightest fraction of a second. But Hamilton? He welcomed it. He threw the car into the corner with an aggression that should have sent him spinning into the barriers. But instead, the machine responded with perfect obedience. It was an act of defiance against physics itself. And then the chicane. The most complex, the most demanding sequence on the track. A place where races were won or lost. A place where champions either thrived or crumbled. And Hamilton? He danced across the curbs with a perfection that defied belief. The suspension compressed and rebounded like a well-rehearsed symphony, the car floating over the jagged edges as if they weren't even there. Each movement was deliberate, each action part of an unspoken language between man and machine. There was no wasted motion. No unnecessary adjustments. Just absolute control. The final stretch. The last test. The moment that would separate this lap from every other lap that had ever been driven on this circuit. The last corner, an enigma of raw speed and absolute precision. The car, balanced on the razor's edge, was pushed to its limits. The throttle pinned. The rear tires begging for mercy. And then boom. He was gone. A rocket, a missile, a force of nature unleashed down the main straight with all the fury of a storm. The crowd, the engineers, the rivals, they watched in stunned silence. The line approached. The digital clocks froze. Fastest lap. Not just by a margin, by a chasm. A gap so large, so incomprehensible, that it sent shockwaves through the entire paddock. The telemetry didn't just show a quick lap, it displayed dominance. The kind of dominance that breaks spirits. That crushes hope. That sends a message that cannot be ignored. Hamilton did not react. There was no celebratory fist pump, no yell of triumph over the radio. He simply drove back into the pits, as if he had just completed a mundane outlap. But those who knew him, those who had seen this look before, understood what it meant. He parked. The engine shut down. Silence. He removed his gloves with the same methodical precision that he had used to navigate the circuit. The helmet came off. And then the first glimpse of emotion, a smirk. Not arrogance, not cockiness. Just a quiet, knowing expression that spoke volumes. And then, without hesitation, he walked. Not towards the engineers. Not towards the debrief. Not towards the data screens where his lap time flashed in glowing digits, a testament to his brilliance. He walked towards the Ferrari garage. A move so bold, so unexpected, that the entire paddock seemed to hold its breath. The moment he stepped inside enemy territory, the atmosphere changed. Conversations halted. Mechanics froze. Engineers turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. This was not a friendly visit. This was not small talk. This was a message. Frédéric Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, stood in front of the monitors, his gaze fixed on the data. But when Hamilton approached, he looked up. There was no hiding it, the unspoken tension. Hamilton met his gaze, unshaken, unfazed. What time did Charles do? His voice, steady, measured, lethal in its simplicity. Vasseur hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty. Just for a moment. But it was enough. 1 second slower than you. Silence. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Hamilton absorbed them, not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. As if he had known all along. As if the entire paddock had known all along. And then the smirk returned, sharper now, more defined. He leaned in slightly, his voice low, deliberate. Well, remember that, he said, his tone like ice. Because it's going to be like this all year. No further theatrics. No need for extra words. The damage had been done. He turned, walking away with the confidence of a man who had already won the psychological war before the season had even begun. Behind him, Ferrari's garage remained frozen in silence. The engineers, the mechanics, the strategists, all left staring at the screens that told a story no one wanted to admit. But this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the headlines exploded. Hamilton sends a warning shot. Psychological warfare at its finest. The greatest of all time leaves his mark again. Social media was ablaze. Fans dissecting every second of his lap, every word of his message. Rivals whispered in hushed tones. Team principals re-evaluated their strategies. Because they knew, this wasn't just another race. This was a declaration. A declaration that Lewis Hamilton was not done. That he was not fading. That he was here to take what was his. And as the next race loomed on the horizon, the question hung heavy over the entire grid. Who, if anyone, could stop him? Because right now, it didn't look like anyone could.